Dr. Eric Weissman is next. He's going to be talking about housing is harm reduction. He appeared on CBC radio. We listened to him on CBC radio yesterday as he gave us a teaser of what we can expect today. Eric has been developing and applying a lived experience form of scholarship to the study of homelessness, housing, mental health, and substance use since he recovered from episodic homelessness and severe substance use disorder over 26 years ago. He's a member of the faculty at UNB in St. John, where he recently formed a visual ethnography lab. So today we get to learn more about that. And Eric, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I'm just going to share my screen. Thanks for having me. And Nancy, that was amazing. I'm so, every time I hear you speak, I learn even more than I had learned before. So I really appreciate it. Can you see my screen okay? I want to make sure that I'm doing this correctly. Yes? No?
Good.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm back where I want to be. Right. So here we are at the 4th annual Harm Reduction. I'm very glad to have been asked to be part of this year. It's I've looked a little bit into the history of the symposium, and in this area, it has an incredible reputation, and it makes a great deal of sense because since moving here about 4 years ago, I've recognized that there's a lot of harm that needs to be reduced in this province in particular. I've lived all over Canada and the US, and everywhere I go, I see the same problems, and I hear the same difficulties that people have. And the reason I hear these stories is that I am also a person with lived experience. Before I did my PhD in 2009 to 13, I had drugged myself out of my PhD in 1988. So I'm what I call a lived experience scholar, and the photo up top is me all bright-eyed and really happy entering my MA, which was, you can tell by the dress, a very long time ago. And then a few years later, after my addictions had suddenly got a hold of me, weighing 128 pounds and entering homelessness for the first time. So I went to rehab. I'm about 26 and a half years sober now. And for me, abstinence wasn't really a possibility. At the nadir of my addictions, I was, I dissolved all the bone in my face from my teeth up to my septum. I have no septum as a result of, I used to, I was a cocaine head really, but I had OD'd 4 or 5 times on heroin. I got all my calories from alcohol. I drank 26 to 40 ounces of alcohol every day. I left my PhD literally to open up a gallery and a bar so I could live in that lifestyle. And at the end of my addictions, I slept on a pool table for 9 months before entering rehab. So I won't get into a really long discussion about my experience, but I will tell you that it was when I went to rehab for the second time, a very long-term rehab, that I was able to find a space, a safe space, and a place. I was there for 7 months. It was paid for by the government of Ontario. I had up to 2 years to recover at my own pace, and I did a lot of thinking about where my life had gone. I mean, to me, from my way of thinking, I was one of the easier cases of experiences of homelessness. Like for me, I came from a very good place. It wasn't a question of money. It wasn't a question of intergenerational poverty. For me, I was the case that everyone wants to say is the norm and is not. I was that person who became homeless because of addictions and just lost interest in himself and in paying bills and having work. And so for me, I don't think of myself as a really difficult scenario. It was pretty simple. I had to get control over my addictions and learn how to live my life again. And so I found a place that was able to help me do that. But I also, in that experience, developed a really important interest in understanding that the most shocking thing to me wasn't being an addict. It was losing the capacity to house myself. And so I went on ultimately started working in Toronto with a bunch of people that I met on the streets who were also very homeless in 1996. And I say very homeless because there were different types of homelessness, and I'd never really thought of it before. You know, when I got back on the streets in 96, there were over 6,000 people living in different, living literally on the streets of Toronto, living in tents or under bridges. And I was hanging out with many of them. And one day I was led to a place called Tent City in Toronto, which was actually, there were no tents there. They were all small shacks built out of garbage that people who had been living on the streets for many years had built. And I got to know these folks, and it became quite a news story in Toronto. And many of you may know of it and might have read stories about it. But as much as the city of Toronto hated it, despised its being there, they held off evicting people who were living there. And so it started off as 6 little huts and ended up being 85 tiny homes of various kinds, again, built from garbage. And then one day the New York Times reported that a baby had been born there, and the public eye turned to that as a sign of great failure, and the mayor looked at that as just an image that Toronto couldn't sustain, and they evicted everybody in 2 hours. They literally sent down close to 300 security guards and construction teams, and they eliminated everyone altogether. So I followed my friends in that camp, in that Tent City for quite a while. And that became the subject for a film that we worked on, a variety of different films that we worked on that looked at life in Tent City. And then, but 8 months after their eviction, they were given housing. Because there was so much public outcry about the evictions that the city of Toronto introduced the first rent supplements of the modern area, because there had been some in earlier periods in our history, and people who had been living on the streets, people who'd been in jail for much of their lives, many of whom had mental health and very serious substance use disorders, were given housing. And it was what we called the Tent City Housing Win, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And so we decided, since it was a collaborative film project, that we're not going to, it's not done. The story is really just beginning. It's really about what housing means, and what kind of effect can it have on people who have extremely difficult physical and mental health conditions. So it became the subject for, I had an opportunity. This is a great, the universe is sometimes quite mysterious, but in 2009, I was able to go back and do my PhD, and I wrote a dissertation on Dignity Village in Oregon, which was the first legal shanty town, which emerged at the same time Tent City did, but had a very different outcome. And I wrote about it, did very well with my dissertation, and converted it into this book that I'm showing you. And at the same time, I met a young scholar from the West Coast who was building tent camps in Oregon, or tiny homes in Oregon. Oregon has 7 or 8 legal tiny home villages, communities. And Andrew Heben is his name, and he wrote this book called Tent City Urbanism. And if any of you are interested in it, I would suggest looking at it. The reason I mention it is that for me, I just came to realize that it's not possible for people to deal with issues, whether they want to or not, or even to think about themselves without a stable base. So I argue, and I have argued for 20 years, and I continue to argue that housing is a form of harm reduction. And it's based on the statement that Eric Weissman made back in 1999, and again in 2005, when he was with the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee, that housing is a form of healthcare. So what I'm going to talk about very quickly today, because I want to show you a short film of a man who I met in Tent City as he evolved and transitioned through housing, is I want to talk about the notion of place attachment and place disruption. And others have spoke to this earlier, this notion of deserving and undeserving character, and the foundations of a holistic solution to the human condition. Because when we talk about harm reduction today, we're talking primarily about harms caused by drug use. But in fact, there are all kinds of harms that especially living in urban centers, cause. And housing has a central role in ameliorating all those kinds of harms. And that's something we learned doing our housing predator research in Toronto. So then I have some notoriety as being an advocate of tiny homes and alternative types of housing. And I really got that from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who said in his big speech during the Depression, that the problems were so massive that the solutions required massive and bold experimentation. And I still believe that, and I know that our national housing strategy calls for experimentation. So most of my work, my dissertation, the book that I just showed you, they ask under what provisions can different types of housing be considered parts of our actual strategies for supplying housing. For example, under what provisions can tiny homes be considered parts of a housing first strategy? Because housing first has a very long, complicated history. It hasn't always looked the way that it does. And I'm a big supporter of housing first. And I've had a chance to study all kinds of different spaces. So I'm going to talk about them just now. One of the other things that I want people to think about is most of my advocate friends in the States now aren't talking about homelessness. They want to, their language really matters. A lot of my work is conceptual. It's about words and language. How do we talk about things, right? What does community mean? What does community housing mean? The idea that people can have a home wherever they are housed seems to be emerging as a really dominant mantra in the States, especially because what people need are structures to live in. They need houses. And so there are a lot of, you'll start seeing the use of the term houselessness rather than homelessness, because COVID, for example, has proven to us that a lot of people are losing their houses, their apartments, their places to live, and they're having to make home in very difficult and tenuous spaces. So for me, the notion of deserving and undeserving character underlies all of our, similar to what Nancy said, we look at people, and I say we very loosely, but there's the law, and most of our policies are based on principles and laws that were brought over with the colonialists in 1601. And those are based on 1400 and 1500, the 1400s and 1500s, they're rooted in the Elizabethan poor laws. In fact, the language is almost the same if you look at the language of some of our laws on what vagrancy is, for example, and the Vagrancy Act, which existed until not too long ago. And so I think that when we think about who is deserving of assistance and not deserving of assistance, many of us may not understand that our attitudes that are handed down to us from generation to generation are ancient, archaic, and need to be rethought. In fact, there is no such thing as deserving and undeserving character necessarily, and that it's been not just and I agree that it's been what's the word, excessively applied to our Indigenous and racialized fellow citizens. But I also see it as a class issue. And having worked in many of the cities that I work in, it was one of the, this is a really bizarre, it's a catch-22. One of the strange things that unites people of different classes, settlers and Indigenous peoples, was when they get tossed aside and cast to the streets, and they finally understand that there's this larger system that loves to discriminate. And I think that most housing exclusive policies use class and race-based discrimination to control the supply of decent and affordable housing. I get angry when I listen to the news about how developers are finding it difficult to build affordable housing under the current circumstances. I think that that idea that profiting off of the instability of people is so normal is what's really wrong with access to housing in Canada and other places. And I think that what we need to do really is shift our perspective to accept the fact that, we didn't always have universal health care. In the 70s, we were granted universal health care, and we accept that now. And I think now that we've embraced housing as a human right by Canadian law, that in time that will come to be true. And the way to do that is to include a number of different types of housing, that some that are more conventional and some that are more what's the word? Progressive. So harm reduction and the harm principle often get confused as well. And this also muddles the discussion about what we're actually dealing with. And in law, the harm principle is the degree to which an action threatens a moral, economic standard or economic standard, or it contains violence, right? And it's another thing that we've inherited from 300 years of history. It's not the same thing as harm reduction. And so when I talk about harm reduction to people in the public, they often think about the lives of individuals who are using and might be living on the streets or living in what other people might consider to be dubious housing as an infraction of the law. And they see the deserving nature of people in terms of the harm principle, not the harm, this broader sense of harm, which refers to policies, programs, and practices that would perhaps minimize the negative health, social, and legal impacts associated with drug use, drug policies, and drug laws. In other words, people see individuals who might be using drugs as less than. And I love telling people my story because it kind of makes them go, what? I wouldn't get that from you. And I go, well, this is the whole point. This is why we need to change our discussion on what these things mean. So the harm principle is a legal and ethical precept. It's not what we mean when we talk about harm reduction. And I think that's really, believe it or not, in trying to make harm reduction more acceptable across the country, we need to be quite clear about what the difference between the harm principle and harm reduction really is. So because they're often confused, it's easy for people to continue to maintain the myth of the undeserving nature of individuals and to have very little faith in that they might be able to change if they want to change. And one of the things that I found in all of the work that I've done in different places is that as soon as people are given stable housing or housing, even if it's transitional housing, there are immediate effects on the psychology of the individual, which lead to ancillary and very fundamental impacts on their health, especially their mental health. So to me, it's all the reason that happens is because we have a moment where people are able to attach to place. Edward Casey was an important philosopher, and he said that the essence of human culture and human civilization isn't about the size of things or where things are located. It's what humans bring to spaces. It's the creative moment where an individual attaches to a space and makes it their own, or where a community forms with other people. And so forming an attachment to place is personal and social, and it's those things that being homeless or very often being a person who's experiencing homelessness and addictions like I did loses. And Julia Woodhull-Melnick, who's a colleague of mine, did some great research on the flooding here in New Brunswick, and I think about it because we talked about place attachment a fair bit. We asked, why do people stay in places that are going to sink? Every year they get washed away, and people stay because it's their home, because they have a connection, and in that connection their identity is wrapped up in that place, and it's a tie to ancestors. It's not something that you can quantify. It's not something that you can see or feel without looking at its representation, the artifacts, the board that an uncle used to mend a wall in 1965. I mean, there are meanings that are important to understanding the human experience that aren't necessarily empirically measurable without a very deep kind of approach, which is why I've chosen in my work to look at things in smaller pieces, very visually, and to try to understand what things mean to people who are in those situations. So a connection to place is vital to human society, and it's wrapped up in what we call social imaginaries, which is the way people see the world, what should or shouldn't be, what is proper housing, what's improper housing. And the truth is that people, when they see things enough, can change their social imaginaries. I mean, they can have a change, sometimes we call it a change of heart, but really it's a change of vision. And so very often, there's a debate about what constitutes appropriate housing. And this is one of the problems I have in my work, and trying to explain to people who don't see tiny homes, for example, as places where people could form a proper attachment to place. I worked with Jesse a little bit on this, his definition of Indigenous homelessness. And the reason I like it is that it tries to expand our sense of connection far beyond the conventional connection to place, which is an individual in a space. Whereas his definition of disconnection, homelessness, is the interruption of individuals, families, and communities who are isolated from their relationships to land, water, place, family, kin, each other, animals, cultures, languages, and identities. And so that's why, to me, if we're willing to embrace that as the definition of disaffiliation, which, by the way, was the term used to describe homelessness until about the 1950s, if we're able to accept that, then we're able to see how different kinds of spaces can actually provide for restoring those kinds of connections for people. So it's the attachment to place and to people that is absolutely key. And to me, we know that many of, we're all familiar with the drug experiments where lab rats do drugs, and then under social conditions, when other lab rats are introduced, stop doing them as much. And we also understand, for the most part, the biochemistry, that certain drugs affect our pleasure centers the same way that social activity and social interaction does. So we know that there are interconnections between drugs work because our bodies are designed to facilitate the mechanics of those drugs, or the physiology, our physiology is affected by those drugs. And so in some ways, our brain and our feelings and emotions are affected by our relationships and our social experiences. So I think what I would like to argue is that harm reduction requires us to rethink what harm actually means and what substances actually look like, and to embrace different visions of place. I mean, some substances that we take on a daily basis, like sugar, are worse for us than some other drugs might be for people who take some of the illicit drugs that people are taking. And I don't want to make this argument. I had a student recently who wrote a paper. It was quite interesting, and they explained the extreme cost to the healthcare system and the loss of life caused by alcohol and tobacco. And I completely agreed with them. And they said, but aren't these monitored drugs? I mean, aren't bars? Can't we think of bars as places of managed alcohol consumption? And I agree with them entirely. So my feeling was that, if we can change the ideas around the use of materials, then we can change the ideas. I mean, if we can say that it's okay to sell cigarettes and liquor, then really the argument is a social one, not a physiological or medical one. So what is the how do you bring housing into that equation? How do I argue to people that, well, it's true, and one of the ways to minimize the chemical impact of a drug is to add another variable, which is stable housing. Because when people have stable housing, they tend not to engage in those materials as much. And one of the important things that I found in all of my work in some of these in tiny home villages and in housing first projects where people had mental health and addiction issues, was that drugs themselves have a certain form of currency. They're a part of the social and cultural economies. And so, in the absence of meaningful connections, or in places and cases where people need to find a place to sleep and drugs will get them that, the drug use is higher. And I was one of those people. For the last 5 years of my addictions, I traded drugs almost every night to find a place to sleep. And so it's another issue that people don't often think about. So housing is healthcare, and healthy lives start at home. 235,000 people a year are considered homeless in Canada, and we know on the streets, those of us who do the work know that this is probably a much higher number. We don't really know how many. We have a much broader definition of homelessness now. So when we're talking about people being homeless, if you think about couch surfing and sleeping at someone else's place as normal, then the number is lower. But the definition of homelessness that I use, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness definition, includes that as a form of homelessness. So, for example, in Oregon, when I did my research, they said that about 3,500 people were homeless, and that meant literally homeless on the streets of Portland, Oregon. But the Department of Education, because it uses a different definition, said over 16,000 people were homeless, and most of those were children because they were sleeping at a friend's place or on a couch. So depending on your definition, the housing itself, the definition of housing or home, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. All I can tell you for a fact is that every city in Canada, people are dying on the streets. And in Toronto, I'm from Toronto, we have the Toronto Homeless Memorial, and the numbers of people dying on the streets is increasing, not decreasing. The bottom line to me, and this is a picture of a woman sitting in front of her home in Dignity Village, is that housing is key to healthcare. It's key to reducing all forms of harm, and safe, stable, and attainable housing also has long-term effects. It can reduce the impact of addictions, PTSD. It almost eliminates criminalization, persecution, and so on. And it does that by creating communities where drug use is actually okay. And I don't mean that it's preferred. It's not like, yeah, you can be part of this community if you use drugs, but if you come to this community, you won't be prosecuted for using them. And Dignity Village was like that. So the cost of not providing housing in Canada, just so you know, is about $54,000 per person who's experiencing homelessness that might be related to drug use. And I've given you the link if you'd like to check out the link. The cost, so the cost of, sorry, let me go back. The cost of not helping someone is about $53,000. The cost of helping someone, providing housing, usually housing under the Housing First model, is between $11,000 and $23,000 per person. And that's just the facts. So even if you're opposed to these, to help providing people housing, regardless of what style of housing you prefer, people live longer, live better, and it costs less to provide housing. That's just the bottom line. It's irrefutable. So my question is, what kind of housing? And certainly not this kind of housing. This is Jay, who lived in a tunnel underneath the Air National Guard in Portland, Oregon. His wife lived in Dignity Village, a few hundred yards away. He had been kicked out of the village and was forced to live under the culvert. And he said, "Oh, I've lived under a culvert for years. This doesn't really bother me at all." The space itself didn't bother him at all. So one of the first things that I was interested in, like I mentioned to you, was grassroots tiny home communities. I call them intentional homeless communities. So after doing all this research in Toronto and other cities, I went to Dignity Village and I stayed there for several months and studied life in the village. You know, as a villager, lived in a shack, and I called them shanties back then. And since then, I've changed my language. That was back in 2010 and 2011. But the amazing thing about Dignity Village was that it was a political claim. It disturbed the city so much that they took them to court, and the nonprofit, these activists won in the state constitution because they had the right under the law to build an emergency campground, and this became it. And every house that you see in these photographs was built from scrap for nothing. Frankly, the city gave them this piece of land, and the average cost to live there for each person at that time was $2.34 a night. My first book was about Dignity Village, and I asked Nigel Dixon to come take pictures of people in their homes. And what you realize when you look at these places and these spaces is, and I don't really, and to me, my book was very critical of the village. In fact, since in the years since, we've gone on to correct the things that were wrong with it. But this is a village without any resources, no city money, no funding whatsoever. People who traded sweat equity for membership and might have had very low paying jobs, but all of them called this home. All of them, their health improved immediately after coming off the streets and moving into these small shelters. And we can talk about that at more length if you'd like to. Just contact me and I'll share all kinds of information with you. At the same time, an emergency rest area was being built in Portland, Oregon, called Right to Dream 2. And they managed to get this piece of land at the foot of the business district for $1 a year because the landlord had a grievance with the city, and they told them what they wanted to do. You know, one of the things that was killing, and don't forget, Portland, Oregon is a small place. It had at the time 590,000 people, but 3,000 people were on the streets, literally. And that's a very high number for a population that small, and they were dying. People were dying. So the same group that opened Dignity Village opened this, what they call an emergency rest area. They're not called a tent camp. That's illegal. They're not called a tent city. That's illegal by the law. And so they were taken to court. They tried to evict them, and the Oregon State legislature wrote new legal language and called them an emergency rest area, which are now legal in Oregon, which is why there are more than there were at the time. Since then, they reached a settlement with the city. The city gave them $1 million worth of housing, and they now are called Right to Dream 2, and they have a tiny home community just on the other side of the river. But it is estimated that they saved over 10,000 lives in the time that they were there, because over 35,000 people per year would use the services of the camp. So these, you know, I don't really want to see people having to live in these places, but they served a certain purpose. this particular camp model on its own was actually funded, and nonprofits would come and bring food and mobile showers. And so when they moved into their they didn't really want to move into their permanent tiny home settlements, but they did save lives, and they did provide, because they felt that if they were moved from their street ministry, that more people would suffer. So this is a little bit more about Right to Dream 2, and you can find them just by Googling Right to Dream 2 on Portland, Oregon. At the same time, the city of Oregon built a housing first model called Bud Clark Commons on the left. And this is a model of housing first in Helsinki. And what I always found interesting, and I wrote about it in that last book, was that when I was in Right to Dream 2, the last time, a young woman died and the ambulances came, and they were talking about she died from an OD, and they were talking about the OD that happened at the Bud Clark Commons, which was a fully supported housing first community. And it just became clear to me that there is no real, what's the word? One size fits all solution. That the way of reducing harm caused by long periods of incarceration and life on the streets is wild and ambitious experimentation with different forms of housing. So the cost for housing first, like I mentioned before, was if you leave people on the streets, as I mentioned earlier, the cost can be as high as $50,000 to $60,000, depending on where it is for medical and other reasons. The housing first model generally per person is between $14,000 to $22,000 dollars per person. And I got this information from the Nanaimo Homeless Coalition. Just by looking at this, you can see that it makes a great deal of sense to limit the amount of money, to limit the kinds of investments we're making, and that housing first is one of the most successful models that we have. So another interesting study that I did that I worked on was at the Wellesley Central Residences in Toronto. This is a place. It's a harm reduction model. It's based on housing first principles, where people pay a certain percentage of their income, and it has people who are living with HIV/AIDS and people who are frail elderly individuals. And the reason that it's an interesting co-residence, but they have full supports on the premises as well for individuals. So one of the important issues that they dealt with there was the problem with stigma in the neighborhood, and the fact that they've been very good members of the community and do a lot of outreach has really helped them. So there are all kinds of types of housing that are proven to improve health outcomes. And I would argue that tent camps, as awful as they seem, provide a very short-term emergency type of assistance to people who need it. There are rest areas where people, like R2D2, where people can go for 24 hours. There are the grassroots tiny home communities, like Homes for Heroes in Calgary. And there are organized and funded tiny home villages, like the ones that I've been showing you, like Dignity Village, and many others now, which are developed. Marcel Lebrun has his community that's in Fredericton right now, the 12 Neighbors, which is really kind of interesting. And then there are regular market units and housing first supports and continuum of care programs. All of these different types of housing are basically based on essential different principles, but provide necessary care for people. So I'm going to share a video with you momentarily. This is a story of Brian Dodge, who had lived in Tent City in Toronto and who would be given housing. And it shows the amazing ameliorative effect of someone with deep concerns and deep troubles after they get housing. So I'm going to, hopefully this will work.
Hello. Smells the same? Is trailer housing? Where's trailer housing smell like?
Remember that building up on Martin Grove?
Yeah. Yeah. Willow Ridge. Yeah. Willow Ridge.
That was a pretty frightening experience, wasn't
I'm glad down here instead of way up
it?
there.
So, Brian, have you had any follow-ups on your cancer treatment?
Yeah, I'm okay.
What did they say?
I'm okay, clear. All clear, my doctor said. He gave me a good bill of health. A1 health.
It doesn't bother you that you're still smoking?
No, it bothers him, not bother me.
What does he say?
He says, "How you still smoking?" I said, "Well, of course, you should know that, Dr. Weissman. How long you known me? 10 years?" Ready?
No. No.
They look scary. See, that's why I couldn't have one of these things. It'd drive me cuckoo. I threw it over the balcony.
Why?
I don't like it. Anything hard to get through my head, I can't. Why
I
is
think
it?
it would have to be hard to get through your head.
Oh, and these things, oh. I want to throw that thing over the balcony sometimes. How are you? How you been doing?
What's happening, bud?
How much, you?
Not much. Let me see your scar. Jesus.
Twice.
And that's where they took the stuff out?
Yeah.
And how are you feeling? Not much. Let me see your scar. So how do you feel, Brian, when you see yourself? Jesus.
Okay, I'm okay with it.
Can you tell me a little more?
Look at that though. That's I could not know. That looked ugly. That all it did, that only looked ugly. That's where I was shot.
That's where you were shot?
That's where I told people that's where I was shot.
You had lung cancer, you said.
I know. But I told people I was shot there. And they believed me.
How much of your life is fantasy, Brian?
My whole life is fantasy, a fantasy world. My whole life is a fantasy world. I've done too much. Done too much, way too much. No, it's not a fantasy. It's not a
That's
fantasy.
where you had lung cancer,
Yeah.
not where you were shot.
No. No, that's what I just told people. They what? They were shot. They were shot.
The dragon.
Dragon.
And hold on a second. And what does the dragon mean?
What's the dragon mean?
Don't move. I just got it in frame. What does the dragon mean?
Dragon. It's just a dragon, but I had to tie it off here and tie it off there and tattoo it myself.
In the joint?
Yeah.
How'd you get the colors?
China ink. Believe me, it's scary. I tell you, Eric, you know yourself. I lived in tent city. I've been through a lot in my life. Okay, I've been seen knives pulled on me, had guns pulled on me. I've fought. I've been knocked out. I've won. I've lost, but never scared me till cancer. I was terrified. Believe
You've
me.
pulled a few guns, haven't you?
Yeah, and I've been terrified.
Like
That's a
I-
bad boy.
So what happened?
Well, I kidnapped. You can go check. You can go check in Ottawa.
You know what? I don't have to.
I kidnapped the police in Ottawa.
What?
I had them all chasing me. I had one cop beside me here, right here, he's driving. As you get on that phone, you tell him back off. No secret or family jewels are going.
Do you remember our last interview? Last 17 interviews?
Oh yeah.
And you never mentioned any of this.
Oh no. I keep a lot to myself.
Okay, well, tell me about that one.
Well, we're in the movies.
All these things you leave out, man.
That's minor
Details,
Eric.
minor details.
That's the best part to leave them out, because I don't want people running away from me. Because I've changed. I don't know if I changed for the good or the worse.
If I take you back, like we're going back now, and you look at this video of all the places we've been together, and to me, these are I call originating moments. These actually happened between you and I, and a lot of these you've forgotten. But when you look at these moments, are you taken back to them, or do you have memories of them that you now have to replace?
Oh, I gotta replace them all.
Because you remember it differently than what you're saying.
Yeah.
Is that true? All of it, or
Yeah.
just some of it?
Some, see, there are a lot of places I don't even want to remember about. I blanked them out of my mind.
Okay, but back then you guys never wanted to see yourselves.
No.
You wanted yourselves to be captured, and you wanted something to be done with it, but you didn't really want to look at yourselves.
No, we didn't. Because it was on the crack cocaine. Crack cocaine. See, when you're on crack cocaine like that, you don't want to see that. You know?
Even if I want to say I've told the whole truth, I never really know the whole truth.
No, you never really do.
So the
No,
only
no.
truth that I know is the truth.
Truth
The truth
that-
I know is the only truth I can tell.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Like this, it's here. You know that's true. So you know that's true.
And did I tell this fairly? I didn't need to talk about it. It's self-explanatory. Right?
Self-explanatory. Yeah, that's when I got my certificate for going to church, entering the church.
It was a big day for you.
That was a big day for me. Yeah. I'm the same way. I'd like to thank Sandra and Jeff for all the years they've been stuck in with me, and Eric through the hard times. Not a good time to talk. Hey,
What does God mean to you?
peace of mind. Peace of mind. Peace of mind.
How does that work out?
How does that work out? You have peace of mind.
Don't you think this is how our connection to other things are? They're always there, but they're not always.
We don't really see them.
Right.
We really don't see them until we run into somebody that we know from a long time, and then, boom, where you see this. Okay? Then reality will come back.
And so I guess the question is it real?
Yes, real.
So the reason that I often show Brian's story is that his transition was really quite amazing, and others that he lived in Tent City with had, by the way, 3 of them, including Eddie Johnston, who's very famous for his role during the Kingston riots. He actually was living in Tent City at the same time, and what was amazing to me was it showed that how these different spaces fulfill different needs at different times, and that how the harms. To understand harm and harm reduction you can't study it in a static way. Like, you have to look at it in terms of the transitional experience that reducing harm produces. And so, when they were living on the streets and living under the train bridges in Toronto, things were really rough. And then they found Tent City, and they moved into Tent City, and they had some housing. They were able to build housing and communities, and some of their parts of their lives got better, and then they were evicted, and they got housing, and they got supports, and there's this incredible progression of harm reduction, the harm of having lived the lives that they lived, having experienced the traumas that they had lived. And so even people with extremely complex I can't say that word, comorbidities and substance use disorders can benefit from housing, and different kinds of housing will answer the question, right? For different people. And while Dignity Village, is a rather crude example. Since Dignity Village started its battle for legitimacy, hundreds of cities have now put millions of dollars into building tiny home communities. And whether people want to see tiny homes or not is not really important, because they're part of the continuum of housing that can help people through their even tent cities serve a vital role given the context that we live in, where people are out of the streets, where shelters are full. So my interest has always been to understand the way that different forms of housing can fit into our solutions. Now, I don't obviously see tent camps as a solution, but I do see them as part of the progress that we're making towards solutions. Tiny homes, secondary units, apartments, housing first projects are better places to live, and people must have places to live. So some of the observations that I'd like to suggest, and if you'd like to watch the entire film, I'll provide you the link at the end of this, is that supports and community engagement are needed for long-term success. That learning how to manage a home and keep it is one of the hardest things for newcomers to do. And there's an entire list of things that people need to do. People that I met who were living in these tiny homes and who were experiencing different degrees of homelessness and degrees of addiction required different solutions. So it was interesting, because when people moved from their tiny homes in Toronto to the apartments that they got. There were different ways of understanding what success was. And Kathy Crow, who you might know is an important, she's a nurse and an advocate. Actually, she and the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee managed Tent City. That she said that it's not important what they succeed at or not when they're in Tent City or even in housing. It's true that people reconnected with family, went back to school, got jobs, and they kept their housing. But what really matters is, and this was true of Tent City, is that people managed to stay alive and their health improved. They didn't die. And even in Tent City, which was a crude place, that minimal amount of housing was enough to help people who most likely would have perished or become extremely ill on the streets of Toronto at a time when the streets were overrun. So one of the questions that Barrick German asked, who was one of the founders of the TDRC, is that all we want from a person, whether they're an addict or not? Which is why I've always talked about housing as low barrier, and that public housing, for example, so-called public housing that has restrictions on what people do in their units is really problematic, which is why I like the tiny home model. Because for example, Dignity Village, each of those homes is considered a self-contained unit. And what people do in the privacy of their own home is protected under the law. So if people, I don't believe that you can have people managing addictions, or if you want people even to think about getting off of addictions, they can't do it without a home. You can't have somebody trying to control their mental health from obscurity. So if you want people to get better, or you want to get better, they're not going to get better on the streets. So we can all act together to get people homes. And that's why, to me, housing is a form of healthcare. There's no question that it is. And then if you watch the longer version of Ethical Traces, which will be available on these slides, it talks about different examples of this. In fact, I was watching a bunch of different movies. The original subtext version that I did is available on this list. And there are other films that show just how people's relationship to housing is complex. It's not simple. One form is not better than others. And how even forms, I'm very happy to have a home. I bought my first home in my life at the age of 60 because of how precarious my life had been, and I'm enjoying it. But I'm beginning to understand why some people can't handle this kind of existence. So I recommend to people that they view these films that I've suggested on this list. And one of them is called Shelter from the Storm, made by Michael Connolly, about the role that Kathy Crow has played in the city of Toronto. I think the real comment that I wanted to make most was that you can't ask people to address their needs, and you can't ask a society to address its needs to help people with mental health or addictions from obscurity and from the survival anxieties that are necessarily born of the shelter system, life on the streets. We did some really interesting research, and we're in the middle of it now, actually doing more of it on post-secondary student homelessness. And it was a horrible finding in our original study to find out that many young students were staying in abusive lives or getting involved in the sex trade in order to have housing. You keep seeing stories in the paper about students living in their cars to get through their undergraduate degrees. And so to me, the idea is that housing itself is like, there's no way to reduce harm of any kind unless people have stable and safe housing. And so I like to argue, and I hope this has conjured up some questions for people about what constitutes safe housing. The truth is that even tent camps provide some degree of safety for people. And ultimately, I would like to see people living in things like these progressive supportive housing first communities, if that's what they choose. And that's about it. I don't know. Hopefully there'll be some questions I could answer.
And there may be, Eric, but right now we're right on time.
Oh, sorry.
And we're going to take a short break before we come back to have a panel discuss something pretty important. It would be tone deaf for us to ignore COVID and harm reduction. And we've assembled a panel that at 3 o'clock will start to unpack some of these issues for us. So let's stand adjourned for 15 minutes. Let's take a bit of a bio break and reconvene at 3 o'clock. Thank you.
I always take too long. I'm sorry.
Not a problem, Eric. It was great.